Hi, fam. I don't even really know what we're going to talk about today, except to say that I've been experiencing intense nostalgia since I've been here. It'll be, 2 weeks tomorrow. So between, me cycling around here as a child or working here when I was in college and living on the bay in Margate, or sharing time with my grandmother, making her breakfast every day after my swing shift in the casino, coming home at 6 a.m. and listening to her tell the same stories every morning. It's been really intense nostalgia, which, is bittersweet. Nostalgia is great, but it's also, it can be a little sad, a little, memories of people, places, and things that are gone and in the past, or actually literally passed on. Sorry, it's my Palo Santo. So that's been really intense. And I was reminded, I told you about my Uncle John, who lived with Aunt Eleanor. Oh, sorry. And I was reminded of a story about Aunt Eleanor, who, if you'll recall, was a very, get the light coming in, very pious, elderly, grandmother type woman who never married either. She was married to the church. But apparently, in her youth, ran around with a character named Legs Mahoney, which I'm pretty sure if any of you have watched Boardwalk Empire, that really is a very historical biopic of what life was like here at the turn of the century, the early 20th century. And that would have been the time that Aunt Eleanor and Legs Mahoney were having shenanigans, which is just really hard to believe, because she was Aunt Eleanor with these giant Coke bottle glasses, like thick Coke bottle glasses, and this character named Legs Mahoney, which is just too funny. But anyways, she lived with Uncle John, which was the uncle with the sparkliest blue eyes and big smile, who used to hand us $20 bills. Apart from that, my grandmother was, I see her as very much a matriarch of our family, and her husband, Alfred, was the first person that I knew of that passed away. And I remember, because it was the bicentennial year, it was 1976. And I was 10 years old. Okay, now you know how old I am, but I don't care. Age is just a number. So it was a bicentennial year, and my grandfather had just passed away. And the story goes, that same day, he had just had a physical and was given a clean bill of health by his doctor, and he passed away in his sleep that same night. So I remember when we went to his funeral, it was my sister and my two cousins, and of course their parents, my parents, and lots of other people. And we were all at the casket, and, everybody said, touch him. What does it feel like? And I was the only one brave enough to do that. And I'll never really forget that sensation to this day. But it really is true. Like, if I knew then what I know now, which is we are all just souls having a human experience in this meat suit, so to speak, you really have the sense like this soul has left the building, Like, this truly is just a suit for the soul to allow it to experience all there is to experience on this learning planet. And I think the book was called The Road Less Traveled. I believe was the book that I read that caused me to lose any fear of death that I might have had, some probably 20 years ago already. Because if I have the story right, that is the book that speaks of a very well-regarded psychiatrist who was interviewing patients or putting them into, what do you call it? Regression. It was regression therapy, and some of his clients would start speaking in Aramaic or other ancient languages that are no longer used, and that they had no conceivable notion of how to speak. And he was coming to terms with the fact that these people were actually speaking of past lives that they had lived. And as the story goes, one of his clients actually came through with a message from this psychiatrist's son who had passed when he was either a baby or a very young child. And it was a very poignant message, and that's when he knew that he was dealing with something which I guess at that time would be considered paranormal, which I think is becoming more mainstream today, which is, reincarnation and past lives. And I'm often drawn to medieval times and colonial times and Egypt personally. So I know that I lived during those times and probably thousands of lives before that. But yeah, I think it's fascinating. So that was my first brush with death, was my grandfather, Al, Grandpa Baum. And then I touched on, in one of my earlier videos, a friend who had passed away at Notre Dame University who got hit by a drunk driver crossing the street, and his name was Michael. And Michael has been a significant name in my life, whether it was Archangel Michael, who I know is very present in my life and has been since I was a baby, or my adoptive father, Michael, who was my closest ally apart from my grandmother. And then, of course, my friend Michael, who passed away, who many of you who do comment on these videos also will remember, Michael Cogwell. May he rest in peace. But I was studying in Spain, and I told you I would tell you the story, and so I will. While we're on the topic, I had paid for my last semester of college. I was going to SUNY Oswego, and I was able to earn enough money to pay for my tuition to go to the University of Sevilla in España, Seville, Spain, in the fall of 1989. And my ethnicity is Spanish, Italian, and Puerto Rican, which I learned much later, which is another great story, which is how I learned about my biological family, which I'll share at another time. But so foreign languages came very easily to me. They always did. And so I worked in Atlantic City for the summer, lived with my boyfriend at the time, Dave, which was a bit of a scandal in and of itself, because when we landed, we were with my grandmother on Quincy Avenue here in Margate. And I remember we were taking a nap. We were fully clothed, and there was no monkey business going on. And she came rolling in to the bedroom and said, "Not in my house, Missy." And she was, whacking the bed with her cane, and it was a big scandal, and we were asked to leave, which completely understandable. She was very Catholic woman and very observant and also very pious, as were, the rest of the fam, the Irish German family that she married and came from. But anyways, so Dave and I lived on the bay, not far from where my grandmother lived. But anyway, worked in the casino, paid for my trip to Spain, went to Spain in the fall of 1989. And it was December 7th. I remember so clearly, so vividly, like it were yesterday. I was sitting on my bed in the what was called solo dormir, which is basically only to sleep, translated, instead of the other residencies, which were basically included food or no food. I couldn't afford to pay for food. So I was living with Sophia, who was about 4 feet tall and very, very shrewd, elderly Spanish woman, another grandmother type, in a very tall building with lots of flats in it. And I remember the woman upstairs was Anna, where another friend of mine lived, and they would all chat on their balconies and wait for all the American girls to come home at night. And she would say, "Juan, ¿quieres comer?" She was always yelling, "Juan, ¿quieres comer? Juan, do you want to eat?" to her son. It's funny what we remember. But anyways, I was sitting on my bed in my room in the winter. It was December 7th, and I clearly heard in my mind somebody answering back. I didn't know what clairaudient was. I didn't know that I was clairaudient, although there's another story from my youth that I can share about being locked in the cellar of my then childhood home, by my sister, who thought it was very funny, and it wasn't, because that was an unfinished basement, which was dirt and rocks and mud. And there were spiders and things, and there were dark corners that I just wouldn't go to, but the laundry was down there, and my sister and I used to have to do the laundry. So it was, 100, and now it's 130-year-old farmhouse. Oh, probably older than that. It's much older than that. But anyway, plate glass windows, not the tempered glass, and you push them up, and if it falls, it's gonna break and cut you. But I got locked into the basement, and I heard clear as a bell, like as if somebody were standing this close to my ear. Somebody whispered my nickname, Mindy, and just, Mindy. Oh, I was screaming, and I was like, let me out, let me out. It was right here. And that was really the first time that I heard anything. And that house was so haunted. We used to hear footsteps on the stairs at night, and my sister would sleep on the floor in my room because I was terrified. And she was somewhat of a protector at the time, although she was equal parts bully, equal parts protector. And somebody sat on my bed, and the whole bed sank down by my head one time, and I just remember falling asleep out of sheer fright. But anyway, I was in Spain, and I was, as we do, thinking things over in my mind, and it was like having a conversation with somebody. Somebody would answer. I would think a thought. Somebody would answer back. Like, I wonder what they're having for dinner. And, the voice said, yeah, me too. Like maybe they're having the potato pancake or something like that, which was a regional dish that I absolutely loved, and I have since replicated recently, having reflected back. But it would go on the whole time I was there, but it happened on the day of the anniversary of Mike's death. When I went home, I went to New York to live with my parents at the time. And I knew my relationship with Dave was over. I went to live with Alice and Mike. And I remember telling her what happened when I was in Spain, and I was in the back seat, they were in the front seat, and she just literally turned her head and said, "I believe you." And I said, I don't recall if I knew it was him at the time, but she basically sent me to a woman who, no kidding, her last name was Bizzarri, Bizarri, Francine Bizzarri, from Auburn, New York, which is a couple of lakes over from where we, grew up, in Auburn, New York. And she used to help the local police there find, missing people. So I went to see her, and halfway through my reading, she said, "Who's Michael?" And I had never been to a psychic, and I had never, I just burst into tears. And I said, "Well, Michael's my father." And she said, "No, this Michael died before his time. And he is, basically, he hadn't fully passed, or he was in the in-between, or whatever, however she referred to it at the time." And I just could not stop crying. And I said, "Well, why me?" And I said, Mike Cogwell, my friend who passed away, she said, "Yeah, he died before his time, and you need to say a prayer for him and tell him to look for the light and to walk through it." Well, I cried all the way home. She told me a lot of other things that would come to pass, but I cried all the way home, because I went to his wake in a blinding snowstorm when Alice called me to tell me of his passing. I fell on the floor, and me and my roommates, they rallied and drove me from Oswego to a suburb of Syracuse and Skaneateles on the lake, or Marcellus, I can't remember. My dad was buried in Skaneateles, but we got to the calling hours, and it was a blinding blizzard we drove through to get there. And I just remember walking up, and there was a huge long processional of people. I found some friends, jumped in, and got all the way to the front, and I saw his father grab a man. His father was facing me, and he just lost it. And I lost it, and I couldn't go in. And I couldn't pay my respects. And that always bothered me. So by the time, years later, 89, he passed in, I guess, the year before. I'm not sure. It wasn't long before that. But by the time he came to me in Spain, and the time I had come home, and the time that I went to see this woman, and I said my prayers, I went to find his resting place. And I remember I couldn't find it. And it was in the winter time, and there was snow on the ground, and I was wandering through this cemetery just crying. And told you I was a crybaby. A baby rabbit appeared. A baby bunny, and it hopped off, and it stopped on his grave, his stone, which was flat. It wasn't a raised stone. And I learned later that his mother was struggling with his passing and couldn't bring herself to erect a proper, or what the usual cemetery stone. I don't know what they're called, headstones. So yeah, that is the story of Michael. I said my goodbye. I prayed for him. I told him to look for the light and to walk through it. And I never heard from him again, but I was told later by a pranic healer who healed my broken finger, which you can see is very much I had a comminuted fracture because I slammed it in a car door on a drunken night with other moms, wild and running wild one night at after a Britney Spears concert, of all things. I was told that by a healer that he was actually, she said, "Who's Michael?" Again, "Who's Michael?" I said, "Well, Michael's my father." She said, "No." She said, "This is a young man, and he's holding up the back of your heart." So that's the story of Michael. And I know that he is a guide and he is with me, as are so many others. So just know that we all have loved ones looking over us. Family, not family, mostly family, but it's your soul family, and they are with us all the time, just like God. Angels, guardian angels, loved ones, ancestors, friends. And so I wanted to share that with you today. I hope that you will know that when you hear things in your home, whether it's rattling or lights flickering, that's usually family. And don't be afraid. Acknowledge their presence, say hello, and welcome them.